Welcome back to Sarah History. Today we are going to go somewhere dark. Genuinely dark. Not dark in the way that war stories are dark, where there is violence and heroism and the drama of armies facing each other across a battlefield. Dark in a quieter, slower, more suffocating way. The darkness of houses where everyone inside has died and the doors have been nailed shut from the outside. The darkness of cities where the gravediggers ran out of ground. The darkness of a world that looked at itself in the mirror one morning and did not recognize the face staring back. We are going to talk about the Black Death. The pandemic that arrived in Europe in 1347 and over the next 5 years killed somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire continent's population. Roughly 25 million people in Europe alone. Possibly 50 million worldwide. In some cities, Florence, Venice, Hamburg, the death toll reached 60 or 70%. In certain villages, everyone died. In certain regions, there was no one left to harvest the crops or bury the dead. It was the single greatest demographic catastrophe in recorded human history. And like all the great catastrophes, it did not just destroy. It transformed. The world that came out the other side of the Black Death was unrecognizable from the world that went in. The medieval order, the feudal system, the absolute authority of the church, the rigid class structures that had defined European life for centuries, all of it cracked under the weight of so many deaths. And from those cracks grew the seeds of everything we recognize as the modern world. This is the story of the plague. But more than that, it is the story of what happens to human civilization when it is forced, violently and without warning, to confront its own fragility. Let us begin where it began. Part 1. Out of the East. The Black Death did not appear from nowhere. It had a geography, a journey, a point of origin. The disease was caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. It lives primarily in the bloodstreams of rodents, marmots, rats, squirrels, and is transmitted between animals by fleas. Under certain conditions, when a rodent population carrying the bacterium collapses, the infected fleas abandon the dying animals and look for new hosts. If humans are nearby, the fleas jump. And when Yersinia pestis enters a human body, what follows is one of the most aggressive and lethal infections known to medicine. The Black Death is believed to have originated somewhere in Central Asia, possibly in the region around Lake Issyk-Kul in modern Kyrgyzstan, possibly further east in China or the Mongolian steppe. The question of its precise origin is still debated by historians and epidemiologists. What is known is that by the 1330s and 1340s it was moving west along the trade routes of the Mongol Empire. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, had created conditions of unprecedented connectivity across Eurasia. Goods moved, people moved, and disease moved with them. The plague reached the Crimea, on the northern shore of the Black Sea, in 1346. There, Mongol forces of the Golden Horde were besieging a Genoese trading post called Kaffa. The plague struck the Mongol army. The Mongol commander, a man named Janibeg, made a decision that would reverberate through history. He had his men catapult the bodies of plague victims over the walls of Kaffa. It is one of the earliest documented uses of biological warfare. Whether the catapulted bodies were the primary means of transmission or whether the plague had already entered the city through other means is debated. But the psychological and physical impact was devastating. The Genoese merchants in Kaffa did what merchants do when a city becomes untenable. They got on their ships and they sailed. To Constantinople. To Messina in Sicily. To Genoa and Venice and Marseille. They carried the plague with them. In each port where they docked, the disease leapt ashore. In some ports, the ships were recognized as death ships and refused permission to land, the sailors visible at the rails covered in black swellings, already dying. But it was too late. In port after port, the rat populations of the harbor absorbed the infection from the ship's rats, and the flea population spread it through the city. By the spring of 1348, the plague was in Italy. By the summer it was in France and Spain. By 1349 it had crossed the English Channel. By 1350 it was in Scandinavia, having traveled on a single ship to Bergen in Norway, whose entire crew was found dead when the ship drifted into harbor. By 1352 it had swept through Russia and reached the borders of Poland. In 5 years, it had crossed a continent. Part 2. What it did to the body. Before we talk about what the plague did to civilization, we need to understand what it did to the human body. Because the people who lived through it, who wrote about it, who described it, who painted it, who prayed against it, were describing a physical experience of a particular kind of horror. And if we are going to understand why the Black Death broke the medieval world psychology as thoroughly as it broke its population, we need to feel something of what they felt. Yersinia pestis enters the human body through a flea bite. In the most common form, bubonic plague, the bacteria travel to the nearest lymph node and begin replicating with catastrophic speed. The lymph node swells into what medieval observers called a bubo, a swelling the size of an egg or an apple, hard and excruciatingly painful, appearing in the groin, the armpit, or the neck, depending on where the flea had bitten. The skin over the bubo turned black, hence the name Black Death, though contemporaries used various names, including simply the pestilence or the great mortality. The swellings could rupture, leaking blood and pus. The victim ran a high fever. The lymphatic system, the body's infection-fighting network, was overwhelmed and turned against the body itself. Internal bleeding produced dark blotches under the skin. The victim often became delirious with fever. Death typically came within 3 to 5 days of the first symptoms. The bubonic form of the plague had a mortality rate of roughly 30 to 60% in untreated cases, meaning that some people survived it, though how and why remained a mystery to medieval observers and is still not fully understood in terms of individual immune response. But there was a worse form. Pneumonic plague, when the bacterium infected the lungs, was spread not by fleas but by respiratory droplets, from one person breathing near another. It was almost universally fatal. Death could come within 24 hours of the first symptoms. And septicemic plague, when the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly, killed so fast that victims sometimes went to bed healthy and were dead before morning, before any swellings had time to form. The speed was what destroyed people psychologically as much as anything else. You could be perfectly well in the morning and dead by nightfall. Your neighbor could be fine at breakfast and cold by supper. The randomness, who got it, who survived, who died fast, who died slow, seemed to follow no logic that a medieval mind or any mind could parse. And the Church, which existed to explain suffering and provide comfort in the face of death, had no explanation. God was clearly angry. But why? What had been done? What could be done to stop it? Fasting, prayer, processions, confession. The Church prescribed all of its tools and watched them fail, one after another, as the priests administering last rites died alongside their parishioners. Part 3. Florence is burning. I want to take you to one city, Florence, Italy, 1348, because we have an extraordinary witness. Giovanni Boccaccio was a Florentine writer, one of the great literary figures of the Italian pre-Renaissance. He survived the plague of 1348 in Florence and wrote about it in the preface to his masterpiece, The Decameron, a collection of 100 stories told by a group of young men and women who have retreated to a country villa to escape the plague. The preface, describing what Florence looked like at the height of the epidemic, is one of the most harrowing documents in the literature of catastrophe. Florence had a population of approximately 100,000 people before the plague. By Boccaccio's account, confirmed broadly by modern historical analysis, somewhere between 45 and 65,000 of them died within months. He described the way the disease spread through families, one sick person infecting the entire household. He described the way people abandoned their own relatives, terrified of contagion, leaving the sick to die alone without care or comfort. He described the way the dead piled up faster than they could be buried, first in individual graves, then in mass pits, then simply stacked in the streets waiting for collection. Gravediggers who had been paid a fortune for their work died at their shovels. Priests who had been paid double to administer last rites sickened and died mid-prayer. Dogs and cats, believed by some to carry the disease, were killed in the streets by panicked citizens. Boccaccio described the complete dissolution of normal social bonds. People fled the cities for the countryside. Rich men sealed themselves into their houses with food and wine and refused to admit anyone. Others took the opposite view. Since death was coming regardless, they should eat and drink and be merry and not think about tomorrow. People who had owned property and businesses walked away from everything and left for parts unknown. The normal architecture of obligation, to family, to community, to church, to law, simply fell apart under the weight of the dying. He described the bodies. 3 or 4 in front of every door in the morning, collected the way we collect rubbish. He described the gravediggers, low men, called beccamorti, the crow men, who carried the dead on litters through the streets, chanting. He described the mass graves, the bodies laid in layers like merchandise, covered with a little soil and then another layer of bodies. This was Florence, one of the wealthiest, most cultured, most sophisticated cities in Europe. And it was, for months, a charnel house. Similar scenes played out in Venice, where boats carried bodies to mass graves on outer islands. In Paris. In London, where the churchyard of the Charterhouse became one enormous grave and where the Thames sometimes carried bodies out to sea. In small English villages that have no name anymore because everyone in them died and no one came back to tell the story. The silence that settled over depopulated landscapes, the untended fields, the empty houses, the unmilked cattle wandering loose, the unrung church bells, was described by survivor after survivor as the most alien and terrible thing. A world designed for human noise that had gone quiet. Part 4. The Flagellants and the Scapegoats. When a civilization cannot explain catastrophe, it looks for causes it can understand. And the causes it finds reveal what it fears and what it hates. The Church's inability to explain or stop the plague produced two of the most dramatic and disturbing responses in European medieval history. The first was the Flagellant movement. Beginning in Germany in 1349 and spreading rapidly across Central Europe, groups of men, and some women, organized themselves into processions of public penance. They traveled from town to town, flogging themselves with leather whips studded with metal spikes, drawing blood, crying out to God for mercy. The theology was simple and terrible. God was punishing humanity for its sins. The only response was to demonstrate suffering, to show God that humans understood their guilt and were punishing themselves before he had to do it further. The Flagellants were terrifyingly popular. Enormous crowds gathered to watch the processions. The Flagellants were fed and housed by towns they passed through, treated as holy men doing necessary holy work. But the movement quickly escalated beyond self-flagellation. The Flagellants began preaching radical theology, that the sacraments of the Church were unnecessary, that their own suffering was equivalent to absolution, that the end of the world was near and the Church hierarchy would be swept away with it. Pope Clement VI, who spent the plague years in Avignon and reportedly survived by sitting between two large fires that his physicians believed would purify the air, condemned the Flagellants and ordered their suppression. They were hunted down and dispersed. The second response was more straightforwardly monstrous. The Jewish communities of Europe were blamed for the plague. The accusation, known as the well poisoning libel, claimed that Jews had deliberately poisoned the wells and water sources of Christian communities to spread disease and murder Christians. There was, needless to say, no evidence for this. Jewish communities died of the plague at the same rates as Christian communities. But the accusation spread faster than the plague itself. Beginning in southern France and northern Spain in 1348 and moving rapidly east through Germany, Jewish communities were massacred. In Strasbourg, in February 1349, roughly 2,000 Jews were burned alive in the city's Jewish cemetery. In Mainz and Cologne, thousands more. In some cities the Jewish community, knowing what was coming, set fire to their own homes rather than let the murderers take their property and died together. In some cities, the massacres happened before the plague had even arrived. The accusation was enough. Pope Clement VI issued 2 papal bulls condemning the massacres and pointing out explicitly that Jews were dying from the plague too, and therefore could not logically be responsible for spreading it. The pogroms continued regardless. Rational argument has never had much traction against a mob that has already decided what it believes. The Jews who survived were expelled from many of the cities and regions where they had lived for generations. Many moved east, into Poland and Lithuania, where the rulers offered relative protection. This migration, caused by the plague's social catastrophe rather than the plague itself, is one reason why Eastern Europe became home to the largest Jewish populations in the world for the next 5 centuries, up until the Holocaust. The plague killed millions. Its social aftermath displaced and destroyed communities that had nothing to do with it and had no defense against the need of frightened people to find someone to blame. Part 5. The World After. Let us talk about what survived. Because something did survive. And what survived was, in certain ways, more important than what died. The feudal system, under which peasants were bound to the land of noble lords, owing labor and a portion of their crops in exchange for protection, had depended on one fundamental condition. The condition was that labor was abundant and land was scarce. There were always more peasants than there was work for them, which meant lords could set the terms and peasants had to accept. The plague reversed this entirely. Suddenly there was far more land than there were people to work it. Lords who had once commanded dozens of serfs found themselves with empty fields and the crops rotting in them. Surviving peasants discovered, for the first time in living memory, that they had bargaining power. They could demand wages. They could demand freedom from labor obligations. They could simply walk away from one lord and go work for another who offered better terms. Lords who refused to negotiate found their fields empty. The results were not immediate or smooth. There was enormous resistance from the nobility and the church, who correctly understood that the demographic shift threatened the entire social order they depended on. The Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381 was one of the most dramatic expressions of this new consciousness. Peasants marching on London, demanding the abolition of serfdom, killing the Archbishop of Canterbury. The revolt was suppressed. Its leaders were executed. But the underlying shift in the labor market could not be suppressed. Serfdom in Western Europe effectively ended over the following century, not because of a revolution but because economics made it unworkable. Wages rose. The standard of living for surviving peasants and working people actually improved significantly in the decades after the plague. There was more land per person. There was more food per person. The terrible chronic malnutrition that had characterized medieval peasant life in the overcrowded pre-plague world began to ease. Surviving craftsmen found their skills suddenly in high demand and could charge accordingly. The middle class, the artisans, the merchants, the skilled tradespeople, grew in wealth and social significance. This shift in the balance of power between labor and capital is one of the key foundations of the modern world. The idea that labor has value, that workers have rights, that the relationship between employer and employee involves negotiation rather than obligation, these ideas became economically real in Europe largely because the plague killed so many workers that the survivors could demand better treatment. Part 6. The Church and its Crisis. The Black Death shattered the moral authority of the medieval Catholic Church, and the crack that opened then has never fully closed. The Church had claimed, for centuries, to be the mediator between humanity and God. Its sacraments were the mechanisms by which souls were saved or lost, and its clergy were the people who administered those sacraments. The plague killed the clergy at the same rate as everyone else. Sometimes faster, because priests and monks and nuns were the people who cared for the sick, who administered last rites, who went into the plague houses when everyone else was running out. The clergy died heroically and in great numbers. And as they died, a terrible theological question arose. If a person was dying of plague and there was no priest available to administer last rites, could they confess their sins to a layperson? Could God accept a deathbed repentance with no ecclesiastical machinery to process it? The Church scrambled to answer these questions, issuing guidance and rulings even as its own representatives died faster than they could be replaced. And people noticed. They noticed that the prayers did not stop the plague. They noticed that the priests died the same as everyone else. They noticed that God made no apparent distinction between the pious and the sinful, the devout and the lapsed, the priest at the altar and the peasant in the field. Death came for all of them with the same indifference. This did not, for most people, immediately translate into loss of faith. But it translated into something more dangerous for the institutional Church, a deep and lasting skepticism about the Church's claims to special authority, special knowledge, special access to divine protection. If the Church could not protect its own clergy, what exactly was its claim to mediate between humanity and God? In the generation after the plague, new forms of religious life began to flourish that emphasized direct personal experience of God without ecclesiastical mediation. Mystical movements. Lay religious communities. Preachers who spoke to ordinary people in their own languages rather than in Latin. The Lollards in England. The Hussites in Bohemia. These were not yet the Protestant Reformation that would come in 1517, but they were the ground cracking before the earthquake. Martin Luther's revolt against the Church emerged from a century and a half of accumulated doubt, much of it seeded by the Black Death's demonstration that the Church's protection was neither supernatural nor reliable. Part 7. The Art of Death. The Black Death produced an art, a literature, an aesthetic of mortality that permeated European culture for centuries. The Danse Macabre, the Dance of Death, became one of the central artistic motifs of the late medieval period. Paintings and engravings depicting skeletal figures of death dancing with representatives of every social class, pope and emperor, merchant and peasant, child and old man, became ubiquitous on church walls across Europe. The message was explicit and democratic. Death comes for everyone. Your rank and your wealth and your virtue offer no protection. You will dance with death whether you wish it or not. This art was not despairing in a simple way. It was also, strangely, equalizing. In the world before the plague, the rigid hierarchy of medieval society was assumed to be natural, God-ordained, permanent. The Danse Macabre demolished this. In the arms of death, the king was no different from the beggar. This was theologically orthodox. The Church had always taught that all souls were equal before God, but the plague made it viscerally, undeniably real in a way that no sermon ever had. The literature of the period reflected the same shift. Boccaccio's Decameron, with its 100 stories told by survivors hiding from the plague, is full of merchants and craftspeople and ordinary people as protagonists, not knights and nobles and saints. The ordinary human, navigating an uncertain and dangerous world with wit and resilience, became the subject of literature in a way that the rigid aristocratic culture of the earlier medieval period had never fully allowed. Geoffrey Chaucer, writing his Canterbury Tales in England in the 1380s, gave voice to every class of society. The knight, yes, but also the miller, the wife of Bath, the cook, the pardoner. The democracy of death had produced, in art and literature, a democracy of subject. Every human life was worth examining. Every human story contained truth. Some historians argue that the Renaissance, the great flowering of art and humanism in Italy in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, was partly a response to the Black Death. That the plague's demonstration of human mortality created a new urgency around human achievement, human beauty, human individuality. If life was short and its end unpredictable, then the things made in life, the painting, the sculpture, the building, the poem, became more precious. The Renaissance's obsession with individual human achievement, with the glory of the human form, with the celebration of earthly life rather than its denial, these feel, in part, like the response of a civilization that had looked into the abyss and decided to build something beautiful in response. Part 8. Why it still matters. The Black Death is not ancient history in the sense of being irrelevant. We have lived through our own version of a pandemic in recent years. And the questions the Black Death raised, about social trust, about institutional authority, about how human beings behave when a threat is invisible and indiscriminate and the experts cannot fully explain it, those questions are not historical. They are permanent features of human civilization. The plague revealed something that is always true but that comfortable times allow us to forget. That civilization is thinner than it looks. That the social contracts and institutional structures and shared assumptions that hold society together depend on conditions that can be disrupted by forces indifferent to human arrangements. That when those conditions are disrupted severely enough, people become capable of extraordinary courage and extraordinary cruelty in roughly equal measure. The priests who went into the plague houses knowing they would likely not come out, that was human courage of a kind that deserves to be remembered. The physicians who attended the sick with nothing that could actually help but went anyway, the same. The ordinary people who cared for their sick neighbors when the official structures had broken down, who buried the dead when no one else would, the same. And the mobs who burned the Jewish communities. The lords who tried to reimpose serfdom on the survivors because they could not accept that the world had changed. The pardoners and the false priests who sold fake cures and fake absolutions to the terrified for profit. That was also human behavior under pressure. Both things, simultaneously, always. The Black Death killed a third of Europe. It ended the medieval world and began the process that would produce the Renaissance, the Reformation, the end of feudalism, and the beginning of the modern labor market. It changed the art, the literature, the religious consciousness, the social structure, and the demographic map of an entire civilization. And it was caused by a flea. The smallness of the cause against the enormity of the effect is one of the great reminders that history offers us. The world can be changed, utterly, permanently, beyond recognition, by something too small to see. By something that cares nothing for our plans and our structures and our certainties and our prayers. The survivors rebuilt. They always do. They grieved and they rebuilt and eventually they made something new out of the wreckage. The world that came after the Black Death was, in some measurable ways, better than the world that had gone in, more equal, more questioning, more artistically alive, more conscious of individual human worth. That is not a comfort to the 25 million who did not survive to see it. But it is the truth of what their deaths made possible. And remembering that truth, holding it without flinching, is what history is for. This has been Sarah History, Episode 7. Thank you for being here.